Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our event to discuss the findings and implications of a report recently published by the OECD called A Comprehensive Approach to Understanding Urban Productivity Effects of Local Governments, Local Autonomy, Government Quality, and Fragmentation. And it deals with some of these important questions around, is good local government important for achieving higher urban productivity? And in particular, what are the effects of local government quality, autonomy, and fragmentation on urban productivity? And for those of us focused on the UK, which obviously many in the room on the event today will be, these are important economy, and I stress that, economy related questions that we need to answer in relation to devolution if we are indeed to restart what is definitely a paused devolution agenda in the UK. So fortunately, as I've sort of said, the new analysis from the OECD looking at cities and towns across Europe provides us with some insights and indeed some answers to these questions. And in a moment, we're going to hear from two of the report's authors. But as always, before we begin, let me say a few words of housekeeping. The event is being recorded and will be made available on our website after the event. During the event, your microphones will be kept on mute. If you want to tweet about the event, the hashtag is CFC Urban Productivity. There will be lots of opportunities for questions. You can submit your questions at any time. You don't have to wait until they're finished. And you can do that by sending your question via the chat function to ask a question. When we get to question, if time allows, we like you to ask your question on occasion, so be prepared. But if you prefer me to read it out, that's also fine. Just let us know when you post your question and we'll be all done and dusted by 12 o'clock. So let's get underway. Let me introduce our speakers. So first off, we're going to hear from two of the report's authors, Rudiger Ahrend, who's the head of Economic Analysis and Statistics Division at the OECD's Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities, and Alexandra Tsvetkova, who's an economist and policy analyst at the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities. After we've heard from Rudiger and Alexandra, we'll get a response from Professor Tony Travers from the LSE, and then we'll get into a discussion and some questions. So Rudiger and Alexandra, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, fine. Let me first, thank Andrew and his team for inviting us. So we're very pleased to be basically back again in the webinar, but still to be back and to present the results of our work. And I hope that next time when we do that, we'll be able to come over physically and meet in real time, and that would be very nice. So anyway, basically today we're looking at an issue that is very important, and that is basically how you structure your local level and what are the impacts then on productivity. And we're looking both on the quality of the governments. We're looking at basically the system of decentralization that you're having in place. And we're also looking at the administrative organization. So we're looking at the measure of fragmentation, and that's something we're measuring basically by the number of municipalities that you're having within a functional area. Can I have next slide, please? Alexandra? Or who's moving the slides?
Is Alexandra due to move the slides? If not, can one of my colleagues step in? Did it get stuck? Did it get stuck, Alexandra? So Alexandra is doing it, I think. She's in control of it. It's her screen.
Okay. So anyway, I can go on while she's doing that. So this is basically joint work with Dylan Young and Alexander Lembke, who I don't know are maybe among the participants. But anyway, so this is so they're also giving them some of the glory or the shame of the paper, whatever you think about it, basically. So can we go to the third slide of the main results now? So basically what we find, so kind of like giving it away from the start, is that government quality is positively linked to urban labor productivity, but, and that's the big but, it's only when you have the right governance arrangements. And also, I mean, when you're looking, because I mean, devolution obviously is a hot topic in the UK, and that's something we are aware of in the OECD, is when you're having good quality institutions and limited fragmentation across the functional areas, I mean, then devolution is positively associated with productivity. On the other hand, I mean, if you're having very poor quality institutions, then a more devoluted system can also kind of like, I mean, have negative impacts on productivity. Fragmentation, administrative fragmentation is a kind of a barrier. It means it mutes effects. It means basically when you're having good quality governments at the local level, but you're very fragmented, then basically it hinders what the good local governments can do. And so you're having a lower effect, lower positive effect on productivity. On the other hand, in a situation where you're having bad quality local governments, in that such a situation when you're having devolution, it's less harmful, because basically, I mean, what the local governments can do is limited anyway by the fact of the administrative fragmentation, and I'm coming to that in a second. And so finally, what we see also is that the most productive urban areas are the ones where you have high quality government institutions and high decentralization and low horizontal fragmentation. So basically, we're having we're having all these three factors united, basically. Can we have next slide, please? So when we're talking about cities, I mean, what we mean are functional areas. We are basically focusing in the OECD on functional areas because, I mean, city boundaries, the administrative boundaries are not very meaningful, generally speaking, because, they were often done like 150 years ago, when, I mean, the city was just a small part of what the urban agglomeration has become today. And so we're focusing on the functional areas. We're having a database for that at the OECD. And I mean, kind of like functional areas are extremely important. I mean, I'm using cities as a shorthand for the functional areas. I mean, when you're looking at it, they're accounting already for something like almost 54% of the global population, and that's growing every year. I mean, a lot of the innovation is taking place in the bigger agglomerations, and they're typically also one of the most productive places, or the most productive places of their countries. And so they're really the motors, they're the hotbeds of the global economy. And what is also typical of the urban agglomerations is that they're very complex. In that sense, governance and government institutions are probably a lot more important in the large agglomerations than they are like in smaller entities, because of this complexity they have to solve, and to really have good quality and well-adapted institutions that fit the situation is of possibly is of higher importance in this large agglomerations than in smaller cities. On the good side, at least for Europe, we have now data not only on urban economic activity, but also on the governance arrangements, and that's why we've been able to do that work. And that's also why, I mean, the work is basically, I mean, the empirical part is constrained to the European countries, because that's the one where we're having all the different databases that we need for this work. Can we have the next slide, please? Just wanted to give you an overview of the functional areas we're looking at. I mean, London, for example, the functional area is slightly larger than what generally people call Greater London. The way we calculate it is we're looking at an urban core that we calculate by its having a certain density of population, and then we're looking at commuting flows. And when there's a certain threshold of commuters from areas, we kind of like count them in the commuting area, and that together then is our functional area. We used to have this database for the OECD countries for some time. We have recently been able to extend that in a project with the European Commission to the whole globe. And I mean, as you may remember, we presented that a year ago in a seminar with you, and just wanted to kind of like remind you that we're having this database now, and invite everybody to use it abundantly. Can we have next slide, please? Okay. So the idea is, as already mentioned, to look at different types of governance arrangements and how they're affecting labor productivity. On the one hand, I mean, we're looking at quality of government. As you probably all know, there's a very large literature out there who is looking at quality of government indicators more largely. I mean, for example, a lot of literature on corruption out there, and which is generally showing that, I mean, good quality of government is helpful in many dimensions for economic development and so on and so forth. On decentralization, it is a more complex situation. I mean, when you're looking at the cross-section, what you see is that rich countries, developed countries tend to be more decentralized, but it's not that clear-cut whether there's causation or in which way it may be going, because it may also be going from the sense that obviously it's possible that it's from decentralization follows economic development, but may also be that with economic development you have higher levels of capacity, human capital, and then also kind of like, I mean, decentralization follows from that. Also, maybe the society becomes more complex, or it may also well be that kind of like in the process of development, more generally, I mean, both income levels go up and the level of decentralization generally increases. So I mean, it's not really clear what kind of causalities there are and which way they go, but you have a very strong cross-section correlation between higher income levels and levels of centralization. Let me tell you right away also that the UK is a bit of an outlier. I mean, given for the income levels, the level of decentralization in the UK is relatively, I mean, or very low compared to other OECD countries. Now, when you're looking at the literature, it's also a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, there's some studies who are kind of like saying they're showing that decentralization is good for growth or a lot of other things. But there's also literature which is kind of like showing the opposite. So it really depends what you're looking at. I mean, what the exact specification is, what kind of like sample you're looking at. So it's not that clear cut basically. And then finally, there's horizontal fragmentation. So it's basically generally that when you're having different administrative bodies within kind of like a common economic zone, that may create problems. For example, when you're having a functional area, you're having a lot of municipalities, then certain policy decisions, if they're taken by at the municipal level, may be suboptimal because the different municipalities may not take into account that their decisions will have spillovers and externalities on the surrounding municipalities. And for example, I mean, if you're organizing public transport, I mean, on a municipal level in a functional area, I mean, that will not get you very far. I mean, you basically need to take these decisions for the whole functional area in mind. Same goes typically for land use decisions, housing decisions. And so we have been in a recent paper been able to show that basically when in a functional area, you're having more municipalities compared, I mean, for others at similar population levels. Then this has negative effects on the agglomeration benefits, I mean, that you're having. And also there's a negative correlation. So if you're more fragmented, you're having higher levels of pollution, you're having a lower satisfaction with your public transport system. And so, I mean, generally speaking, I mean, there seem to be quite strong negative effects from this administrative fragmentation. It's also something that we're in OECD, we're also doing a large number of case studies. We're going to places and looking at them. And that's also something that we've been repeatedly encountered when we've been to places. And then people were telling us, oh yeah, we wanted to build this and that. It would have been really important, but then it got blocked by this mayor there or for this reason there. And then, so we really have seen a lot of negative effects from administrative fragmentation. Fragmentation can not only be rising at the municipal level. I mean, there's also, for example, a number of functional areas which are between different regions or states. For example, I mean, the metropolitan region of Hamburg is divided into 4 different German states, and that also can be bringing issues with it. Or for example, in Chicago is also kind of like a tri-state region basically, and that also typically entails highly complex systems, often with large coordination problems that are more or less well resolved depending on the institutions you have. And what we're also showing in this work is kind of like that if you're having, I mean, governance bodies that are overcoming this fragmentation, that can be very useful. But I'm probably talking too much about that. But I think it's a really important issue, which is often underestimated by economists. I mean, I started out as a macroeconomist and would have thought that was esoteric nonsense at the time, but it really is very important, and I've come to really see that over the time. Now we're looking at the effect of all these three dimensions basically on labor productivity. Can we have the next slide, please? And so the way we're measuring it, or the data we're using basically for the quality of government, we're using the index that's been produced by the University in Gothenburg, which is basically financed by the European Commission, and which is survey-based, where people are asked what they think about the different dimensions of quality of government, and so that for Europe we have a pretty good impression on that now for regions, and we're also having a certain time dimension there. Then for the autonomy, we're using the local autonomy index. I mean, that's a more recent one. I mean, most of you will know the regional autonomy index. It's basically the same idea. It's based on expert opinions. It's a large panel of experts who are kind of like assessing how much autonomy local institutions, local entities have in countries. There is not always intra-country variation in this index, but you have intra-country variation, for example, in Germany and Austria, because in different länder you have different levels of autonomy for the municipalities, and you're also having a certain amount of variety in the UK, where, for example, Scotland, Wales, and England are having different levels of autonomy in certain dimensions. And then we're finally looking at horizontal fragmentation. I already talked a lot about that. The way we are looking at that is we're kind of like, running regression to kind of like determining for a given level of population, what's the number of municipalities you would expect to normally have. And then if you have less or more, then you're high or low on that index, basically. We have the next slide, please. And then, and where it gets really important is that we're thinking that it's not just these three dimensions, but that there's also possibly a lot of interactions between these three dimensions. And I already kind of like mentioned it in the results I gave in the beginning. And so we are looking at the effects of these three dimensions on labor productivity, but also on all kind of interactions. And we're obviously controlling for the usual suspects, which is basically for kind of like the acceleration benefits that are rising from increasing populations. And we're looking also at elderly dependency, use dependency, and already having typical fixed effects in there. So with that, I'll pass the floor to Alexandra. I think we can't hear you, Alexandra. You're muted.
We can't hear you for some reason, Alexandra.
No.
Try again. No, I can see you. We can't hear you. It shows me that you're off mute, but it doesn't. If you start speaking, I don't think I can hear you. No. Try again. No.
Maybe try to.
Rudiger, do you want to carry on, Rudiger, while we try and figure out, while Alexandra tries to figure out?
I was suggesting that maybe she can stop the screen sharing, and I'll try to share it from my screen. Maybe that,
yeah, we've already done that. So we've stopped screen sharing from her. So one of my colleagues is in control of the slides now. So I don't think it's that. I don't know what else it is, whether it's the microphone or whether it's the connection into the laptop or the computer. I don't know. Rudiger, do you want to carry on, and then if Alexandra sorts it out, we can bring her in.
Okay, can I?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Oh, yeah,
that's better. There we are, Alexandra. You're in.
I apologize. It's crazy with my laptop. I never know when.
Don't worry.
Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? I do apologize. We lost like tons of time.
Don't worry.
But okay, here is our first results. We are using multi-level estimation. Here you would need to see the pinkish rows and the bluish rows. The pinkish rows show the direct effects, and we see that decentralization on average has negative effect, quality of government has positive effect, like expected, and then fragmentation on average doesn't have any effect. But what is really important here is that the blue lines, all of them are significant. So it really confirms that all these kind of dimensions of regional or local arrangements, they do interact, and we need to look at them all together to understand how things are working. Literature, of course, usually doesn't do it. And one part of it, why it happens this way, is that it's really hard to understand kind of what eventually we have in terms of effects when we have so many interactions. If we can go to the next slides, I will show how we can actually make sense of what we saw in the table. We can plot marginal effects. These are marginal effects of decentralization. And what we need to see are the lines with whiskers, whether they are above the line, the red one, or below the zero axis. So we can see that on average, the effect is negative. But if we do have low horizontal fragmentation and we have high quality of governance, the effect goes into the positive area. If we can go to the next slide, please, I will show the same for quality of government. Here again, we see that the effect on average is positive. It is above the red line, which denotes zero effect. But once we go into high fragmentation, the result goes into negative or insignificant kind of area. Let's go to the next one. We are not showing results for fragmentation, which was insignificant. Everything is in the paper, all details. So everybody who would like to see it can refer there. But here I would like to illustrate the results. So we used our model to predict productivity for each city. We have 242 cities. Helsinki came up as the most productive place, ranked #1. Radom in Poland came out as the least productive place in terms of our predicted productivity using the model. And then Prague happens to be right in the middle. When we look at Helsinki and Radom, actually, what is striking is that the values of devolution or decentralization are pretty close, but values of quality of government are very, very different. So this tells us that quality of government does play a big role. So if, for example, we take Radom and we assume that its quality of governance or government goes up to the level of Helsinki, we expect the predicted productivity to go up by 58%. Now, if we look at Prague, it's actually also a very nice illustration why the decentralization and fragmentation really work in between of economic outcomes at the regional level and quality of government. Because Prague does have quality of government pretty close to Radom. It's pretty low. But if we increase it to the level of Helsinki, we don't see any significant or large effect. Why? Because decentralization is very low and fragmentation is very high. On the other hand, it also prevents the negative effects from happening. So if quality of government in Prague goes even lower, we also do not expect any major changes in terms of labor productivity. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here are two more results that I would like to highlight, and we are done actually. So here, quality of government is a composite of 3 pillars. One is lack of corruption, one is quality, one is impartiality. So here, what I would like to highlight is that when we look specifically at each of the pillars, we see a very strong negative effect of corruption, which is actually very much magnified in places that happen to be decentralized. So when places have more power in the sense to do whatever they want, and they are corrupted or the quality of government is low in this specific pillar, the negative effects that we see, they are larger. And in the next slide, I would like to show some differences in terms of time. Oh, actually, one more slide, please. So it is before and after the Great Recession. I would like to draw your attention to the blue line, which shows the changing effect of fragmentation after the Great Recession. So what these results show is that over time, it becomes kind of more, the negative effects of fragmentation are increasing. So quality of government has positive effect, but in more fragmented places, this effect is diminished. And this is observable only after the Great Recession, which can link to the growing sizes of cities, complexity of the public services provision, and the increasing need to actually coordinate, which might be harder when we have fragmented arrangements. So let's go to the concluding slide. We wanted to draw a few implications for Britain. As Rudiger said, Britain is quite an outlier. It is a country with very or relatively high quality of government, but very low local autonomy. And what our results show, using all European cities that we have in our data set, is that devolution in this context can have positive impact on urban labor productivity. So we did the exercise for Leicester, and if we assume that if autonomy increases by 1 standard deviation, we expect the predicted labor productivity to increase by 6%. And if we take this exercise to the extreme and we go all the way up to Helsinki, the increase is expected to be by 21%. And I would like to finish here actually by a disclaimer, because our research doesn't show causation. So these are associations and we need to keep it in mind. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both of you indeed. Great presentation, giving us the analysis and then starting to touch on some of the implications. So local institutions matter. I think that's what you were definitely saying. The interactions between quality, autonomy and fragmentation really matter. We should think about how they work together, and focusing maybe on only one of them is a bit of a mistake, in a sense, if you don't fully understand the interactions and where you are in relation to the three variables as well. And then your final point was, the UK is high on quality, low on autonomy, which suggests to me that there's money on the table for us if we were bold in a devolution context, given the research that we've done. But maybe we'll come back to that when we get into discussions. You can say a little bit more about that as well. So Tony, give us a sort of response and a reflection from your perspective. Tony Travers.
Okay, well, first, I'd just like to thank the OECD team for their excellent work and presentation, which I think is a major contributor to our understanding of these issues. On a personal note, some years ago, I chaired something called the London Finance Commission, first for the then Mayor Boris Johnson and subsequently for his successor, Sadiq Khan. And we asked the research team to look at some of these issues, and were slightly saddened to discover, given that we were there to look at the case for devolving fiscal power, at least potentially, to London and other cities as we went on. And of course, the literature was relatively clear that devolving fiscal autonomy to London didn't, or wouldn't, according to the literature, make any particular, wouldn't have a particular effect on productivity and economic output. Although the same, and I realize this research isn't about that, but the same literature also suggested that trust with government, trust in government might improve, which is a sort of separate, sort of more political sciencey issue for another day. So just briefly touching on what we've heard, first thing to say is, of course, productivity is a UK problem, and Rudiger hinted at this. It's not just a levelling up issue, it's a broader United Kingdom problem compared with many other countries in Europe and beyond. But clearly it does play into UK debate, because the differences in productivity within the UK are so high between London and its surrounding region, where it is 70% higher than the average for the UK, which is an enormous difference. So there's a sort of national issue and a sub-national issue, and the implication for raising productivity for many parts of the UK is therefore very, very significant. As far as devolved or decentralized power, the research rightly shows that the UK is not one of the more devolved or decentralized, actually, either you can use either countries as studied, although there are now some areas, mayoral combined authorities. Scotland and Wales are sort of, Northern Ireland are different. You can argue that at least part of the political power that's wielded by government is devolved to the national level within those nations, though less so thereafter within each of those nations. But within England, we do have some examples of devolved or decentralized powers, particularly in London and the combined authorities. And the other thing is that the quality of government measure that is used in this research shows the UK is doing relatively well, not as well as Germany and Scandinavia, but relatively well, and certainly better than many countries in the southern and eastern parts of Europe. So what does this tell us about within Britain? Well, I think it tells us, and it's very helpful as to help us think. I think first is that as Alexandra has elegantly shown, none of these vectors necessarily of themselves improve economic output, but in certain circumstances and altogether they can. So clearly it does, this research, I think, aid those in the UK who believe there should be more devolution within England and separately in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I think it should make us think more about the quality of government, which we don't often think about in public discourse in Britain. We sort of take it as a given until something bad happens. So this is an issue for, in fact, there's an article in the London Times today about whether local government should move over to proportional representation in elections to get away from one party or largely dominated by one party authorities, which I think is something I've begun to think about. So, and I think there's an issue for the political parties here for the regulation of local government. We don't any longer have an audit commission in England, we used to. And indeed the weakness of the regional media compared with the past. There are a whole range of issues buried in that, which I think we need to look more at. And then the fragmentation issue, again, it's a perennial within English and separately British and right across the UK politics. So actually in the big cities, we have relatively large municipalities now with combined authorities or London-wide authorities giving both a local and a city-wide voice. But for the rest of the country, particularly in England, the issue of whether fragmentation needs to be reduced by some form of reorganization, which the Centre for Cities has definitely been looking at, is begged, I think, by this research too. So just to complete, to finish, I think there's a number of very helpful encouragements for us in the UK to think from this research about how much further we should devolve or decentralize power. Secondly, in England, whether the structure of local government is most appropriate for driving productivity. And third, we think we should think more about the quality of government and what would make that better. It's not something we discuss enough, and I'm hugely enthusiastic. I'd like to thank the OECD for helping us, provoking us to think more about these three issues. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Tony, we've had quite a few questions. Keep them coming in, please, and we'll try and get through several of them. I suppose the first question, we've had a couple on Rudiger or Alexandra maybe, is just, you touched on right at the end, the UK sort of view. If you can you just expand on that a little bit and just in a general sense paint a picture of the UK compared to the other European situations that you were looking at? That was one question. And then another one is, you talk obviously about the interactions between quality, autonomy and fragmentation. Just say a little bit more about this, the individual weighting of each of those and whether they're playing off against each other or not. Because as Tony just said, the conversation in this country at the minute is really around devolution. We got close to some issues around reform, which were maybe dealing with the fragmentation, but we've kind of backed away from that. We've backed away from devolution as well, but that's a slightly different issue. So just paint a picture for the UK first, and then just give us a sense as to how the three variables are interacting with each other and playing off against each other? Rudiger, Alexandra, who wants to respond?
I can start, and then Alexandra can say something on the interactions. First, I mean, thanks a lot, Tony, for your kind and very thoughtful words. I very much, I mean, agree with basically, I mean, all what you said. If you want to situate the UK a bit on the dimensions that Andrew just has been kind of like drawing, it is on the fragmentation side. It is it's not perfect, but I mean it's much better than certain other countries. For example, fragmentation is a huge problem in France or the Czech Republic. I mean, France has more than 30,000 municipalities. The French are very good in kind of like inventing mechanisms how to make an unfunctional system work well. While the main question wouldn't be whether you can kind of like rather start from, you know, making a more functioning system from the start, but there obviously is a lot of political capital and trust vetted in the mayors, and therefore nobody wants to touch the I mean the situation of having all these small municipalities based in France. So I mean on the fragmentation side, I mean the UK is doing relatively well. I mean, as I was saying, I mean there is definitely room for improvement. I mean in the large agglomerations, I mean you're having now these more overarching views, but I mean there is still a certain degree of fragmentation that could be overcome, I think. That's on the fragmentation side. On the quality of government side, I mean I think, I mean looking at the survey that's been done, I think gives probably the best evidence we have. I mean, we don't have anything better than in the OECD. So what that means is basically that, I mean, the UK definitely, while also there remains some room for improvement, but definitely the quality of the local governments is very largely sufficient for us for being able to having larger levels of the concentration of decentralization, which in some other countries, I mean, Tony, you mentioned them indirectly. I mean, the case is maybe less clear cut, but I mean, in the UK, that certainly is not a problem. Then on the level of decentralization, as we already mentioned, I mean, the UK, I mean, given its level of income and also given its level of the quality of local governments is really very much of an outlier. It is much less decentralized than comparable OECD countries. Now, we're not really having any policy at the OECD. We were saying that countries need to have a certain level of decentralization. What we're saying is that, I mean, we're talking about making decentralization work. I mean, we are kind of like drawing attention to the fact that decentralization as such is not a panacea, because you also need to make sure that, I mean, you're installing the relationships in a way that they function well, because I mean often when you decentralize, you end up having some overlapping functions, and you need some time to kind of like fine-tune the system, and that's really important to kind of like fine-tune the system and making it work. Then again, I mean, given that the UK is such a big outlier compared to other OECD countries, that gives some food for thought whether there could not be some, you know, some improvements from a more decentralized system.
Great, thank you very much, Rudiger. So Alexandra, just say something about the interaction between the, you know, the three factors or the three variables, and is quality doing all the heavy lifting on in the research really? And if you haven't got that, the other two kind of fall away in terms of significance or not?
It seems that indeed quality of government is the most, I wouldn't say most significant, but it is most consistent driver in a sense. Okay, I should again make a disclaimer that driver is not appropriate word here, because we are looking pretty much at associations. But then again, if you have high quality of government, it's really good to have higher autonomy, and then ideally less fragmentation. But maybe actually we didn't look much into it, but I would assume that maybe in better kind of quality of government and more autonomy, these places are better able to figure out how to coordinate, even if they are relatively more fragmented. If you have low level of quality of government, then actually higher fragmentation and low autonomy comes as a blessing, because it doesn't allow these dysfunctional governments to have any sizable effects on the economic outcomes. In terms of interactions, it seems that at least in terms of coefficients, autonomy seems to be more kind of have maybe larger effects as you look at the kind of on the surface. But again, we all need to keep in mind that we are looking at all functional urban areas across Europe. So there might be, and I would totally expect to have also geographical variation in terms of how things interact in different, maybe not even countries, but at least different groups of countries. It could be so-called old Europe, or it can be new accession states, etc., etc. So I'm pretty sure that dynamics can differ, and we didn't, unfortunately, look at it in our work.
Brilliant. Okay, and we've had again. I know you touched on this towards the end. You know, you're not speculating on causation on the one hand, and bring Tony in on this as well. Get the OECD colleagues' initial reaction. Are you looking at, or are you thinking about then the mechanisms by which quality translates into decisions made, or the mechanisms available, in the sense that, you know, I know the other work that you've done, you were touching on it, Rudiger, in relation to transport, for example, and the ability to, the mechanism is transport and transport planning, which we know has an effect on productivity. But were you looking at, and did you look at any of the mechanisms by which then their quality or autonomy or fragmentation, how that impedes or works through the mechanisms available to those institutions? Rudiger, do you want to say something on that? And I get Alexandra to come in, and I get Tony as well.
We're not looking at that in this paper here. We did in the past, when we did the study on agglomeration benefits and fragmentation. We try to understand, well, what are the channels. We did a certain number of case studies also to look at these issues. And what we're thinking are the three main areas where fragmentation can be problematic, and maybe I'll be adding a fourth one. The first one, obviously, most obvious one is probably transport. Then the second one is everything connected with land use planning, because I mean, when you kind of like, you know, I mean, if a mayor decides to kind of like, I mean, put some, you know, I mean, I don't know, sports stadium or kind of like some shopping facility in a place that may be good for his municipality, but may be bad for the overall, you know, I mean, agglomeration. I mean, that's a pretty obvious effect. I mean, for example, I have an example where basically research institutions which were kind of like dealing with a very large research infrastructure that was kind of like essential to them, were not placed next to this research infrastructure, but they were placed like 15 kilometers far away, just because, I mean, that was the administrative border, and people, you know, on the other side of the border wanted to have it part of, you know, part of their turf, basically. So I mean, there's a lot of bad land use planning that's potentially going on when you're having this problem of fragmentation. And then also, I mean, where it seems to matter or could matter is also for economic development, in the sense that when each municipality is basically going out on their own and trying to kind of like, you know, I mean, market themselves outside, that they may not be very efficient. It may be much better if you are like a large metropolitan area, you go out there and you say, I mean, come to my place, because we have like inner city locations where you can have, if you're like high value added, if you want like, you know, hip areas, here we have these offices. And if you need like more space, we're having these commuting areas where you can kind of like actually, you know, even kind of like acquire large amounts of land at relatively, you know, affordable prices, and you can have like production facilities there. So I think that also can help to have a more complete, you know, package that you can offer, and that in a way can also help for the economic development side. And the fourth pillar that I didn't look at that much at the time, but what I have come to think is very important, is really housing. Because you often have the problem that, I mean, a lot of municipalities think, they all agree that housing is very important, but then a lot of them actually thinks that especially the more high density housing should be built somewhere else, but not in their municipality. And that obviously then leads to situations where everybody knows that housing needs to be built, but it doesn't get built, and then house prices go through the roof. And I have some places in mind, which I'm not going to name, but I mean, there's some pretty obvious examples out there.
Yeah, no, very good. Alexandra, do you want to add anything in there in terms of the mechanisms?
Yeah, I would like to actually draw a little bit attention to the quality of government again. We did look at the pillars, corruption, impartiality, and quality of public services provision. The values come from the survey of people or residents, how they perceive these issues in their regions. But I think it all translates also into, let's say, ease of starting a business, how businesses are invested or they feel they can work and be successful without any interference. But also if we look at corruption, let's say, I think it can distort the efficient resources allocation. So apparently this there are mechanisms how this can translate into labor productivity in a place. And then if we look at the specific pillars or components of the autonomy, actually the effects that we see, a lot of them are the ones that show up as significant are the ones that are related to fiscal dimension, which Tony already mentioned, and the average effect comes as negative. But it feels that if the right arrangements are in place and quality of government is high and there is efficiency in both public services provision, but also maybe in resources reallocation within the region as a result of impartial and not corrupt government, there is a way for this to translate into better outcomes.
Excellent. Okay, Tony, your reflections on this. I mean, you touched on earlier on. We are considering local governments particularly, and therefore there are trust implications and questions. This is a particular institution that we're looking at, not just any institution, and that I think that's important in its own right.
Yes, and I mean, within the UK, and I don't know about other countries, haven't researched it. One thing that I think works to the avoidance, very, very largely, of corruption and actually the improvement in quality is that the professions, the people who work in local government tend to be national and in some cases international, i.e., they can go to New Zealand or Canada to work as well as in the UK for obviously sort of historic and language reasons. And I think that the professional networks that exist for things like chief executive and finance officers are very, very important in this sphere. Again, understudied in some ways, I think. And so that's one thing I would add. And I think that being able to bring in somebody who knows how to be a chief executive of a municipality who's worked somewhere else, but who is still working in the same system is a great power, a great strength, really. So that I think is something worthy of thought. And the other thing is that slightly counterintuitively, I wonder, and this is more a question really, for Rudiger and Alexandra, which is that I think in some parts of the UK, because we do have relatively large municipalities, I mean, many of the large municipalities around big cities like Manchester or Birmingham or London are actually bigger than cities elsewhere. They are very large enterprises, and they are to some extent competitive as well as collaborative. So there's a sort of, I've always been intrigued by the competitive versus collaborative nature of these relatively large municipalities within cities. So, Manchester and Salford, or within London, you can see some of them build tall buildings, others build virtually none, and so on. So I think that's another element of all of this to consider, that within a city, a degree of coordination and collaboration is inevitably correct and good. But I do just wonder whether some competition may also be economically important as well.
That's a good question. Alexandra, do you want to come back on that? You were smiling because, in a sense, the fragment.
No, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful question. And I think it goes back into where the literature started on the autonomy, like Thibault, all this, if people are voting with their feet, there is a impetus for municipalities to compete and provide better services, etc., etc. I think it is extremely important. On our side as researchers, the drawback is that information or data is not necessarily available for this to measure it, because there also, what might be more important actually, not the presence of competition, but where they compete and how they compete. Because competition can be, in one cases we can compete and become better. In some cases, we can compete by undermining our competitors. And this one, I think it's extremely important and really relevant dimension for which we cannot really see much in data unless we go and do the case study. But I think for general understanding how things work, my bet for this one would be, it would be some type of U curve or something where some type of competition is good. When you go overboard, it becomes bad, and the other way around.
Can I just add, Andrew? I think there's been some research done historically about British cities in the 19th century when they were at their height of their growth, or the cities in sort of China would be today in some ways. And they were definitely competitive in a good way, i.e. they looked at the standards of public services in other cities and then tried to bring in tramways or public bathhouses or libraries, whatever it was, opera houses, so that thus the beautiful buildings you see in all the British major city centres, all for that reason. So that's why I'm struck by, and there's no reason, I think, if you look around Britain today, the cities, all of whom will be on this call, are simultaneously collaborative and competitive in a good way, I would argue.
Yeah, no, that's a very good, is a very, very good point. I want to, one of the reasons why I was particularly interested and enthusiastic about the research is, and this is my sense, take it, and I get a comment from Tony and then from OECD colleagues. So my sense, Tony, is that central government in the UK, at least, doesn't really believe that local governments can positively affect economic performance, in a sense, take it from where it is to somewhat somewhere better. But they do believe that they can make it worse, in a sense. They can do things that, make things more difficult. Your thought on that? I mean, which is why I was interested in the paper, in a sense. It's trying to provide some of that, the economic rationale, the economic evidence that actually local government, what it does, how it performs, how it functions, actually can improve performance. So your reflection on my sense, Tony, and then I get OECD colleagues to say whether what they feel, but also whether they get that from other OECD countries as well. I don't know, Tony.
Well, I say this with deference because Paul Sweeney's on this call. I can see him on the screen. And I think there's quite a lot of Treasury orthodoxy in Britain that takes the view that, to some level, competition, different tax rates, different anything really between local authorities is inherently going to be distortion. It's going to distort things. That somehow, if the whole of the United Kingdom had exactly the same tax rates, planning system, everything, forgive me, anybody from the Treasury online if this is a parody of your view, that somehow that then companies would make decisions about location and about everything else they do unimpeded by all these, distortionary, all these other things. So I think that there's a very powerful political cultural sense in the UK, which now is sort of concentrated in England, that difference is somehow problematic, and that therefore, in terms of where companies locate or where people get public services, the nearer it's all to being the same, the better. And the difficulty with that, I think, is that it deadens experimentation and makes it less likely that the kind of research that the OECD's have done here, we could kind of replicate within England, for example.
Yeah.
We couldn't really replicate it inside England because we wouldn't have a measure, unless the Centre for Cities came up with one, of the quality of government. That would be popular. Quality of government from place to place within England and across the UK. But there's a challenge.
Yes, no, they're quite. Thank you very much for putting that challenge out there. At this moment, I'm not saying whether we're going to pick up that baton or not. So anybody on the call, bear that in mind. That Tony has laid down the gauntlet. It may lay there for a while yet, but we'll see. OECD colleagues, your reflections on, central government and local government. Is the view that I proposed, is that common in other OECD countries? I mean, just your general reflections on that. Rudiger, do you want to come in on that?
I think what is a bit uncommon in the UK is that view that I sometimes have the impression that central government doesn't really trust local government's capacities a lot. That's something which is fairly widespread, but that's typically more widespread in countries where there's a good reason why the central government, or at least a much better reason why the federal government thinks there's less capacity at the local level than you have in the UK. So that's a bit of a paradox, maybe. If I may, I just wanted to come back also on kind of like, I mean, to what degree localities can make a positive difference. And there's two things I'd like to say. I mean, the first one is kind of like, I think that having a good or a bad mayor makes a huge difference for a city. I mean, I'm not going to give any names, but I mean, there is some pretty obvious examples of very good mayors who really brought the cities forward, and also, I mean, the opposite. And another topic that is touching on that is we're doing a study at the moment in the OECD with Bloomberg Foundation on how public sector innovation is affecting outcomes in cities. And there we're showing that indeed public sector innovation is correlated with a number of desirable outcomes in cities. And I would guess, I mean, we haven't done that, we haven't checked that, but I would guess that basically public sector innovation is very strongly correlated with government, because I mean, typically, I mean, bad governments, I mean, they're not the ones who will be very innovative and trying to do new good things, basically. So I would think that, I mean, there's a lot of potential at local level to improve things and to make things happen. And on that, also touching on the issue of competition, I think competition is very good wherever it is kind of like, I mean, you're raising standards or kind of like, I mean, leading to innovation. I think it's much less useful wherever it's kind of like leading to zero-sum games or even negative-sum games. I mean, tax competition is probably more of a zero-sum game or even a negative-sum game. For example, the competition that was done in the US with municipalities investing a lot of money to kind of like attracting the headquarters on Amazon. I think that, I mean, okay, for the ones who got it was probably useful, but I mean, generally speaking, I think the total value for the cities involved was probably negative. So I mean, there's a certain amount of negative games going on there, basically.
Yeah, and of course, you know, we have a kind of form of competition in this country. It's just that localities compete to be bestowed with some status from government, right? Whether you're the latest free port or an enterprise zone, or you get a leveling up fund, or whatever these kind of grand pots of money that government bestows, they run competitions, which I think can be often unhelpful in a different way. So there's different forms of competition going on. We're pretty close to 12. I just wanted to give Tony a kind of final thought on this, but again, from OECD colleagues first off, has the UK government, in all its guises, so, you know, as the UK, but also the constituent parts, have they shown any interest in the research so far? Have they come to you and said, this is fantastic, can we find out more? How do we engage and take it forward? I'm hoping, my fingers are crossed now that we're going to get a positive answer, but who knows, right? I mean, who knows? So Rudiger and Alexandra, please tell me that they've shown lots of interest and they're actively in conversation with you.
What would be your bet on this one?
Probability is low, man, low, I'm afraid. It's Monday, sun is shining, but it's still Monday. Have they shown it? Have they shown any? Come on, you have to tell me. If they haven't, then we can do something about it.
Well, there's a lot of interest in the papers. I mean, it's been very heavily downloaded. It's been very heavily kind of like clicked upon when we send our newsletters. So I mean, our delegates and the are very interested in the topic.
I won't push you anymore. That's a very diplomatic answer, Rudiger, which I appreciate. Tony, the UK government is not interested at the minute in this research. That's what I've gleaned from what hasn't been said. How do we make it happen?
Well, I think we have to, as any good lobbyist, I know we're not supposed to talk about them really, are we? But good lobbyist would tell you, have to convince government that what you're proposing is in the government's own interest. And indeed it is. The UK government wants to raise productivity and the quality of government across the UK. And there's absolutely no reason, therefore, why this research shouldn't give them a clue as to how to do it, albeit they might then have to do things a bit faster, like devolving power or working on the improvement of the quality of government or some reorganization that they're a bit slow at, but actually it is in their own interest. I think that's the key thing. It's in their interest to read the paper and then act upon it. Very
good. On that good comment, I think we need to come to a close. It's 12 o'clock. So let me thank my brilliant guests from the OECD, Rudiger and Alexandra. Thank you very much for your time, for doing the work and talking to us about it. As always, Tony, huge thanks to you for being involved, but also just in a general supportive sense for the centre and for the agenda that we care deeply about. Thanks to everyone for joining, posing your questions. I tried to get through a good number of them, so thank you very much for those. As I said at the start, the recording of the event, a link to the report and the slides themselves, if that's okay with our OECD colleagues, we'll make sure that they're all available via our website, centreforcities.org. Somebody mentioned earlier on, or right at the end, mayors. Our next event is actually on Thursday, and it's the first of our mayoral hustings, and it's to elect the new Metro Mayor of West Yorkshire. So we are having a hustings with the candidates in that part of the world, so they can tell us what they're going to do to improve the economic performance of their places. We may raise some of these questions and issues with them. So if you're about and if you're interested, you can join and have a look at that event as well. But until the next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Take care.
Andy. Thanks, everybody. Nice to see you.